I'm Stephanie, and let's talk books. So we have made it through the first month of 2020, which means it's time to talk about all of the books that I read in January. So I started off the month with a couple of Star Wars novels. The first one I read is A Crash of Fate. This is a Star Wars novel set on the planet of Batuu, which is where the Galaxy's Edge world in Disney World and Disneyland. It's set on this planet of Batuu in the Black Spire Outpost. So this is one of the books that they wrote that took place in this location. It followed a guy and a girl who were children together, but then the girl's family moved away suddenly and these two best friends were separated, and then now as adults, sort of fate is bringing them back together and they're sort of reuniting after being separated for years, and now they are adults. So I thought the storyline was interesting. The only thing that I didn't super like is that the bulk of the story takes place over an extremely short amount of time. I believe it takes place in like one day, and I kind of felt like it was a bit of a stretch for the romance part of the story for these two people to fall desperately in love to the point where they would risk their lives and totally change the course of their lives for this other person who they haven't seen since they were 5. But other than that, if you could just use a little bit of suspension of disbelief for that, I thought the rest of the story was great. I thought that the cover art in particular was really beautiful, and it was fun to see a story set on Batuu to kind of explore that world a little bit more. I know when Galaxy's Edge was first announced and we were getting all the details, some people were upset that we weren't going to be visiting an established Star Wars location and that instead we were going somewhere new. So I thought this was great, and I would definitely pick up another Star Wars novel by this author. The next book that I read is Resistance Reborn, which takes place between episodes 8 and episode 9 of the sequel trilogy, and the story sort of centers around Princess Leia, Poe, Finn, and Rey are going to try and find people to join the Resistance after they were totally decimated in episode 8. So we do have these characters that we already know from the movies. There's also a ton of name dropping from other Star Wars media as far as other books and games and comic books. Now I'm nowhere near 100% caught up with all of the canon material for Star Wars. However, I did know enough to be able to pick out different names and be like, oh, I know I've heard of that person and I have a vague idea of who they are, but I don't know what their story is. And unfortunately, given the time period that this book was set in, there were a lot of spoilers for these characters, because you'd have people being like, oh, hey, this person from canon's my mom and that person from canon's my dad. Oh, but they're dead. So now I know the who's hooking up, and then they're going to be dead by this point in time in the series. So that was kind of a little bit disappointing for me, just not being caught up with everything, and now I basically know what happens to these characters, and it makes me a little bit less excited to want to get to their stories. But if you are someone who is very into all of the Star Wars canon materials and you think it would be really cool to see some of your favorite characters either as side characters or kind of name dropped into the story, then I think you would really like this one. For me, it didn't grasp me as much, again, because I felt like a lot of the emotional investment was in these other side characters that I didn't know. And then I also felt like some of the character choices for Rey in particular didn't fit where I felt like her character was at the end of episode 8. She felt a lot more like episode 7 Rey as far as not being as confident, and she felt very timid and kind of wanting to be off to the side. And I feel like after all that she went through in episode 8 that we maybe shouldn't see her like that anymore. But it's always hard when you have a world with this many people working with all these characters to get everything to run smoothly and make 100% sense to every reader. And then the last Star Wars book that I read this month is the novelization of The Last Jedi. Now, I know that The Last Jedi has been very divisive in the Star Wars community. I happen to be on the love it side, and I really enjoyed that movie. I know it made some unconventional decisions, it made some risky decisions, and I particularly enjoyed that payoff of having a Star Wars movie that didn't just go down a list and check boxes like the other two movies in the sequel trilogy. I really felt like they did. So going into that, I already liked the story. I felt like where the novelization really shone was in the Rey and Kylo sections. I feel like that's where we got kind of the most extras out of the novelization, and for me that's why I would read a novelization, is because I want some of that maybe internal dialogue, internal monologue, where we learn a little bit more about what these characters are actually thinking during the movie. I felt like the other storyline with Poe, Finn, and Rose was more of just a copy from the movie where we didn't get as much of those little extras, and I also particularly felt that the Canto Bight sequence just kind of lost a lot in translation, and that is going to happen with the novelization because some things just naturally work better in one media versus the others. But overall, I thought it was a decently written book and I enjoyed reading it. So the next book that I read is Hawksong. This is one I picked up for the Winter Magical Readathon, week 5, as well as A Crash of Faith and Resistance Reborn. Those are the 3 books that I finished out the Winter Magical Readathon. For this particular topic, I needed a book with wings or feathers on the cover. And I had another book that I was reading, Angel Mage, and that one ended up being a DNF for me. So I had this book on my shelf, and you can see there's a bird on the cover. This is a young adult fantasy, sort of paranormal romance book, but this is a pre-Twilight YA, which if you didn't really get into young adult fiction until after Twilight, the genre really changed. So a lot of the particular tropes that are super popular now are not in this. This is a book that I read when I was in high school, and I really loved this series. It follows 2 kingdoms of shapeshifters. One of them turns into birds and the other one turns into snakes, and they have been at war for generations, so long that they don't remember what started the war. And the 2 heirs to the throne are getting very desperate, and they just really want to find a way to end the war just so they can stop seeing their people slaughtered, because neither side makes any progress, just more and more people end up dead. So then they go off to this other country to kind of have a mediation, and the mediators suggest that they marry the 2 heirs together and join the kingdom so that there can be peace. And so we have sort of a hate to lovers type of a plot where you have these 2 people who have been enemies for their entire lives and who come from 2 very different cultures that have to find a way to work together and also to keep their peoples from killing each other and convince people that yes, we are actually at peace now and the war is over and we're not trying to stab each other in the back anymore. One of the things I particularly love about this book is there's a lot of really great world building and culture development in here. Each of the 2 peoples has really interesting and deep cultures, and the author really set these 2 cultures up so that the way that they each operate inclines them to misinterpret how the other ones react, and so you can easily see why it is likely that people from these 2 different cultures would come into conflict, because the cultures are so diametrically opposed in how they approach different things. For example, the bird culture is very stoic and reserved. They don't show a lot of emotion. They aren't big on public displays of affection. And the snake culture is exactly the opposite. They let their emotions show. They're big into touch and being close together, and more of a big like communal type of mentality versus more of an isolated and individual mentality. And so I really enjoyed this. I'm glad I reread this book. And if you are interested in some pre-Twilight young adult, just to see what the genre used to be, this one is really great. There's a whole series. I think the first 2 or 3 are kind of the best ones. The last couple kind of trail off a bit, but this one is really good. Next up, I read The Song of Achilles, which is a retelling of the Iliad, focusing on the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. So I have not read the Iliad. I am familiar with the general storyline of the Trojan War, so I kind of had some idea of some of the events that were going to take place in this book. And this is one that left me with very mixed feelings. In the first half of the book, I really, really enjoyed it. I loved the way that our 2 main characters were developed and how they kind of had a hate to friends to lovers trope, and I really liked it. I thought that was really well done, and I totally bought the evolution of their relationship. Unfortunately, once we got to the point where they went to the war, things started to kind of fall apart for me, and I have a feeling that a lot of the things that I didn't like are elements from the original story, so can't really fault the author of an adaptation for sticking with those original plot points and character development points. But by the end of the story, I did not like Achilles. I thought he turned into a terrible character. I thought that Patroclus deserved to be with someone so much better. And so a lot of the big emotional moments for the 2 of them didn't hit for me because I was no longer rooting for the relationship. I, of course, knew when, things were going to go wrong, and I didn't care. I was like, let's just run away and you all can just stay there and die, because it's a war and lots of people die. The other thing too is that I was unaware of how long that the Trojan War actually went on, and they were actually fighting there for over a decade. So in the second half of the book, there's a lot of big time jumps, and I get that because we're trying to focus just on this one aspect of this bigger story, and we're time jumping to kind of get the important parts. But I think that also made it a little bit more difficult for me to be invested and to just go along with some of the evolution of the characters, because 10 years is a long time and someone can change a lot in 10 years, but when you go 10 years in just a couple of chapters, it's hard for the reader to stay up with that. As far as how much I actually enjoyed this book, I felt really conflicted because there's things I really loved, things I really didn't like. I am definitely interested in reading other mythology-based works by this author. I know she has at least one other book, Circe, that is out, and I definitely want to pick that one up because I do think she did an amazing job of translating these original Greek myths into a story that is relatable and digestible for the modern reader. Hopefully Circe's storyline is something that I like a little bit better, but knowing Greek mythology, it's kind of 50-50 shot. Sometimes really terrible things happen to people in Greek mythology. Alright, next up I picked up A Crown of Feathers by Nicki Preto. This is a book that I have heard Elliot Brooks talk about a lot on her channel, and she said it was very much like a boy and his dragon type story, except it is a girl and her phoenix. Dragons are cool, but phoenixes are super cool. Giant birds that light on fire and can reincarnate. So good. So one of the things I really loved about this story is there is a lot of lore and a lot of history built in, where you're getting little pieces of like the background of this country and the conflict that they're in, and sort of their history, and so I really enjoyed that, and I thought that that was really good. That's not something I am used to seeing in a lot of young adult books. A lot of that tends to be more shallow, where they will put more of the focus of the story on, say, like a main romantic relationship as opposed to more of this world building, and I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the writing style. I thought it was great. The plot of this one did feel like it hit a lot of familiar beats to me. There were definitely certain things that I felt like I definitely predicted from the outset that this is going to happen, because I have read a lot of these kid finds a dragon egg type stories, so it is a trope that I'm very familiar with, but I enjoy it, so I didn't complain, and there were definitely still some twists in here that I did not guess. And I'm super excited because the sequel comes out in February, so hopefully I can get a copy of that and read that really soon, but this one definitely gets a thumbs up for me. Now we'll move on to the audiobooks I read this month. The first book that I did on audio is The Knife of Dreams, which is book number 11 of the Wheel of Time. I have already done a Wheel of Time reading update talking just about this book, because this is the last book in the series that Robert Jordan wrote himself before he passed away, and then the final 3 books were finished by Brandon Sanderson using all of Robert Jordan's notes and some scenes that he had already finished. I enjoyed this book way more than I had, say, the last 4 before it. Kind of the middle section of this series is infamous for being not so great, but in this book we had a lot of movement in the plot. A lot of things were happening. We got to spend a lot of time with our main characters, which I really appreciated. And I am really excited because I felt like this book is going in the direction that I would want the series to go. It's not going downhill anymore. We're definitely going back uphill. And I'm super excited to see how the rest of this series goes. Next book I read is Deconverted by Seth Andrews. This is sort of a memoir, autobiographical type book by one of the very popular atheist podcasters, and it is his story, his life story about his faith and how he lost his faith and became an atheist. And I listened to his podcast, which I think is super great, and it's narrated by him, and he's an excellent narrator. He has a background in radio, and you can definitely tell I really enjoyed this. I had heard bits and pieces of his story kind of in short form, and it was really nice to hear the whole thing long form. So this is a book that I would definitely recommend picking up. As I said, the audiobook is excellent. I think it's a great way for someone to just get the life experience of a person who was raised in a fairly conservative Christian home, and the things in their journey that led them to question that faith and then let go of that faith and kind of come around to being an atheist. So that's something that sounds interesting to you, then I would recommend this book. And then to finish out the month, I had to put in a little bit of Sanderson, so I reread the Arcanum Unbounded. This is Brandon's short story collection for the Cosmere, which is his sort of MCU where many of his books take place in the same universe. They are connected, the magic systems are interrelated. Certain characters make cameo appearances in other books. So this is kind of the companion book. There are a couple of stories in here that you can read without having read the rest of the Cosmere series. Either they're unrelated to what's going on or they won't give spoilers, but there are quite a few stories in here that will give major spoilers for certain books and series. But Brandon is nice enough to leave a note before each story letting you know what spoilers are in there. So this was an amazing reread for me. I love the Cosmere, and I particularly love all of the little Easter eggs and kind of secret nuggets that Brandon leaves, and there are a couple of stories in here that really, really delve into that kind of deep background area and really give you a different perspective on how the Cosmere works, and I really appreciate that about this. So for me, this gets like 1,000,000 points in world building and just creating this entire universe and how many things are interconnected and planned out. Like, it just blows my mind that one man thought of all of this stuff. Now, I know he's been working on coming up with the idea for the Cosmere for a long, long time, but still, it's just kind of mind-blowing, everything that goes into this book. So that is what I read in the month of January. Let me know down in the comment section below what was your favorite January read, and I will catch you guys next time.